Good morning, Sergeant Church. Today we are going to be finishing off our short series on praying the Psalms. So far we've looked at the imprecatory Psalms, or Psalms of cursing. We've looked at Psalms of praise, Psalms of thanksgiving, and then last week we looked at the wisdom Psalms. And now today we will be looking at Psalms of lament. And there are many other types of psalms that we could look at, but these are some of the main ones. And if we looked at every type and every single variation, we would probably be on this series for about 150 weeks. But again, today we are looking at the Psalms of Lament. Now, laments are the things that we say when we are feeling sad, alone, abandoned, forgotten, or full of sorrow. In the Psalms of Lament, we hear the psalmists saying things like, "Why do you hide your face?" Psalm 44. "Why have you rejected us, God?" Psalms 60 and 74. And "How long, O Lord?" Psalm 80 and 90. The psalmists are crying out for help because of the situation that they are in. They cannot stand the place that they have found themselves in, and so they cry out to God. Now, before we get into any one specific psalm, I want to highlight an important thing about these psalms of lament. These psalms, along with the imprecatory psalms, teach us that we can come before God with our true emotions and without fear of God's judgment or wrath. The psalmists are telling God exactly how they are feeling. And you know what? God can take it. God can handle our feelings and our emotion, and God will not judge or condemn us for expressing them. And more than that, God actually empathizes with us. God hears our cries, and God can relate because God has lived as us with these human emotions. And so these psalms of lament, and really all psalms, teach us that we can come before God with all of our feelings and emotions, and not just with those of praise and thanksgiving, as we often do. Furthermore, these psalms of lament also teach us a way that we can deal with some of our emotions. And so again, these psalms teach us to express our emotions, which in and of itself is a healthy way to begin dealing with our feelings. But they also teach us to put our trust in God. Coming before God with our true emotions is an act of faith. And you'll notice that all of these psalms of lament are addressed to God. And this is how we can begin to deal with our emotions. We express them and we bring them before God in an act of faith. And when we do share our emotions with God and with the church, we can begin to address the cause behind the emotions, and we can begin on a journey towards healing. But what about those times when we don't feel better, and we no longer feel like we can faithfully address God? We may be in the thick of our suffering, or maybe we've been uttering the same sentiments for so long and our prayers have gone unanswered that we no longer feel like we can believe in the goodness of God. Or what about for people who are suffering from a mental illness and cannot physically feel right? I find it hard to say to someone in these situations, well, just keep counting your blessings and trusting in the goodness of God. But people, unfortunately, do say this, and it's rarely helpful. It's really unfortunate, and I'm probably guilty of this myself, but humans tend to say the stupidest things in the midst of others' suffering. And these psalms of lament can actually encourage people to give poor responses, like, well, just keep praying and count your blessings. But God is still good. And there might be truth to these statements, but they are not what the individual who is suffering usually needs to hear. And this brings me to Psalm 88. Psalm 88 is a psalm of lament, and it is one of my all-time favorite psalms. And it's a favorite because it absolutely wrecked my construct of church, and it forced me to grapple with my faith and with God. In a way, this psalm is my Penuel. Penuel is the place where Jacob wrestled with God, and after that he was renamed Israel. This psalm forced me to wrestle with my beliefs, and I came out the other side a changed person. Now, for those who don't know this psalm, it can be perhaps one of the most problematic psalms because it ends in absolute despair. The psalmist wants nothing but for death to take him. And unlike most other psalms of lament where they go from despair to a glimmer of hope, this psalm does the exact opposite and goes from a fleeting faith in God to absolute despair. Now let me read Psalm 88 now, and I'll be reading from the NIV translation. Lord, you are the God who saves me. Day and night I cry out to you. May my prayer come before you. Turn your ear to my cry. I am overwhelmed with troubles, and my life draws near to death. I am counted among those who go down to the pit. I am like one without strength. I am set apart with the dead, like the slain who lie in the grave, whom you remember no more, who are cut off from your care. You have put me in the lowest pit, in the darkest depths. Your wrath lies heavily on me. You have overwhelmed me with all your waves. You have taken from me my closest friends and have made me repulsive to them. I am confined and cannot escape. My eyes are dim with grief. I call to you, Lord, every day. I spread out my hands to you. Do you show your wonders to the dead? Do their spirits rise up and praise you? Is your love declared in the grave, your faithfulness in destruction? Are your wonders known in the place of darkness, or your righteous deeds in the land of oblivion? But I cry to you for help, Lord. In the morning my prayer comes before you. Why, Lord, do you reject me and hide your face from me? From my youth I have suffered and been close to death. I have borne your terrors and am in despair. Your wrath has swept over me. Your terrors have destroyed me. All day long they surround me like a flood. They have completely engulfed me. You have taken from me friend and neighbor. Darkness is my closest friend. What a way to end. Darkness is my closest friend. Now, I don't know about you, but that sounds like someone who is suffering immensely. They've tried giving praise to God. They've tried coming before God and asking for a miracle, but they're done with it. God feels so distant that only darkness remains. Now, many people say that this psalmist was likely suffering from a physical ailment like leprosy. And I'm no psychiatrist, but this also sounds like someone who is suffering from a mental illness. They cannot feel joy or happiness, and the truth of God's goodness feels more and more like a lie, and so they have given up all hope. Now, I know there are a lot of people who have felt this way, completely abandoned, and they end up walking away from the church. Either they feel they have no place or voice in the church, or people have told them that they need to get through it and just give praise to God. They just need to be happy. And either way, the individual feels like they do not belong. And yet this psalm is right there in the middle of the book. And if we read it honestly, it forces us to rethink our beliefs. Does everything have to end in joy and happiness? Or does God actually feel distance for much or even all of some people's lives? Is ongoing suffering actually a reality that will be faced by some people? And will there always be an end to people's suffering in this lifetime? If we accept this, that ongoing suffering does happen, and that God does feel distant to some or perhaps many people, what does this mean for the church? Now again, as we've mentioned in past messages, the Psalms are both prayers of the individual, but they are also to be used by the gathered community of God. So what does a psalm like Psalm 88 mean for the church? What does it teach us as a community? And again, as I've already communicated, a psalm like Psalm 88 teaches us that we can bring any feeling and emotion before God, even if it's a lack of faith. The individual should also feel the same freedom to bring that same utterance before the church community without fear of judgment or condemnation. And in response, a psalm like this tells me that we as the church need to stop telling people to just pray harder and have more faith. After all, some people, due to life experiences or mental illness, are incapable of feeling God's presence and having faith. And this tells me that having faith is not always held by the individual. And if faith is not always held by the individual, then I think we as the church community have a responsibility to hold the faith for the individual. When there is someone who is suffering so immensely that they can no longer feel the presence and goodness of God, then we as the church need to respond in carrying their faith, and we respond in walking alongside, free from judgment, and caring for that individual in whatever way we can. Now, this idea of the church carrying the faith for the individual was introduced to me in the book Darkness is My Closest Companion by Catherine Green McCreight. Now, in this book, Green McCreight talks about her experience with bipolar disorder. She would talk about her highs where she felt like everything was great and that she could take on the whole world. But then she would also talk about her lows where God felt completely absent, and she regularly felt like killing herself. This is bipolar disorder, extreme highs and extreme lows. And during the highs, she would feel close to God, and she would know the goodness of God. But then in her lows, no matter what she knew or had felt previously, it all seemed like a lie. And she said she could not feel any emotion whatsoever. She could not feel the goodness of God. She could not feel the comfort of the church. God was just non-existent to her. And as she said, she had no faith at all. And she was a priest in the Episcopalian Church, a priest with no faith. It sounds ironic, and yet it's incredibly tragic. But she said that during her lows, her church carried the faith for her. And not just the individuals of the church, but also the liturgy of the church. During her lows, when she could not think clearly, the liturgy of the church was still ingrained in her mind. She knew the prayers and the songs and the psalms. And even though she couldn't believe them or feel the truth behind them, it was the regular utterance of them, both by her and by others, that carried her through the valleys. The church carried her faith when she had none to carry for herself. Now, the Psalms also do this. They can act like the church community, and they can carry the faith for us. To me, this is what Psalm 88 does. It teaches the church that there will be people who have no faith and cannot feel the presence and goodness of God. And perhaps these are people who suffer from chronic illness or mental illness, or perhaps they're just tired of the ongoing silence from God. But instead of judging or condemning this lack of faith, the church needs to say, that's okay. It's okay if you don't have faith, because in the church there are people who do have faith. There are people who have felt and continue to feel the goodness and the presence of God. and they are able to come alongside and journey with those individuals who do not have faith. And in the end, this is what praying the Psalms actually does as a whole. They give us a liturgy. The Psalms give us words to speak when we have no other words. They give us emotions to feel when we don't know how to feel. They give us a taste of God even when God feels distant or non-existent. And the Psalms give us faith when we no longer feel like we have faith. No matter where you are at today, whether you are joyful and you're wanting to give praise, or maybe you're needing to give thanks to God, perhaps you're deep in thought and you're seeking wisdom, or maybe you're full of righteous anger and longing for justice, or perhaps you're just completely void of faith and absent of emotion. No matter where you are at, we can all find a place of belonging with God through the Psalms. And so, may we always remember to pray the Psalms. Amen.